"Sir, welcome home." The words were soft, almost swallowed by the clinking crystal glasses and the muted jazz drifting beneath the vaulted ceiling. Yet they struck the room with the force of a forgotten memory. William Harrison stopped walking. His polished cane slipped half an inch against the marble floor. His weathered hand trembled. Every executive at the annual Harrison Foundation Gala instinctively turned toward the elderly man whose quiet presence still commanded more respect than most billionaires ever could. Beside him, Ethan Harrison, the 39-year-old CEO who had transformed his father's manufacturing empire into one of America's most influential technology companies, frowned in confusion. His father rarely reacted to strangers. In fact, after years of declining health and long stretches of silence, William barely acknowledged anyone outside his own family. Yet now he stood perfectly still, staring across the ballroom at a young black waitress frozen beside a silver tray. Aaliyah Brooks immediately lowered her eyes, convinced she had made a terrible mistake. She had only meant to be polite. The greeting had escaped naturally, carried by the old coastal dialect her grandmother had spoken every day of Aaliyah's childhood in a tiny South Carolina community where traditions survived longer than highways. She never used those words outside home. Not anymore. Most people laughed when they heard the accent. Managers encouraged her to sound more professional. Guests sometimes repeated her words back with amused smiles, as though her family history were a curiosity displayed behind museum glass. So she had learned to hide it. Tonight had been different. Seeing William's gentle smile had reminded her of her late grandfather before she had time to think. The greetings simply came out. Now the ballroom had become strangely quiet. Conversations dissolved one table at a time. Even the musicians seemed uncertain whether to continue playing. William's pale blue eyes never left the young waitress. They searched her face with an intensity that made decades seem to disappear. Ethan noticed something he had not seen in years. Hope. It appeared slowly, impossibly, inside his father's tired expression. "Dad?" Ethan asked carefully. There was no answer. William took one slow step forward, then another. Around them, investors worth hundreds of millions of dollars exchanged puzzled glances. Restaurant staff stopped carrying trays. Camera flashes from the charity photographers gradually faded as every lens shifted toward the unexpected encounter. Aaliyah felt her heartbeat climbing. She considered apologizing. She considered walking away. Instead, she remained exactly where she was, fingers tightening gently around the edge of the serving tray, unsure why an elderly stranger looked at her as though she had opened a door no one else could even see. William finally whispered something so quietly that almost nobody heard it. Almost nobody except Aaliyah. Her eyes widened. It was the very same dialect. Not merely similar. The exact rhythm. The exact melody. Words that should have disappeared generations ago floated through the glittering ballroom beneath towering chandeliers and million-dollar paintings. For one suspended moment, wealth meant nothing. Status meant nothing. Every expensive conversation surrendered to a language almost everyone believed had already been forgotten. William's lips parted, but whatever memory had risen inside him seemed too fragile to survive the noise of the ballroom. He simply looked at Aaliyah as though time itself had folded in half. Ethan gently rested a hand on his father's shoulder, his voice calm but cautious. "Dad, do you know her?" The older man did not answer. Instead, his eyes remained fixed on the young waitress, searching every detail of her face with quiet disbelief. Aaliyah lowered her gaze again, embarrassed by the attention gathering around her. She had spent nearly 2 years working at Hawthorne House, one of Manhattan's most exclusive private restaurants, and her greatest talent had always been remaining unnoticed. She arrived before sunrise, polished silver until every reflection looked perfect, memorized the preferences of regular guests, and moved through crowded dining rooms so gracefully that people rarely remembered she had been there at all. That was perfectly fine with her. Invisible employees rarely became the subject of complaints. Invisible employees kept their jobs. She had learned that lesson long ago from her grandmother, Evelyn Brooks, the woman who raised her in a weathered cottage surrounded by salt marshes and ancient oak trees along the South Carolina coast. Every evening, while preparing dinner together, her grandmother refused to let old expressions disappear. She spoke in the family's coastal dialect with warmth and pride, telling Aaliyah that every word carried the footsteps of generations who had survived impossible hardships without losing their dignity. As a little girl, Aaliyah never questioned it. Those sounds were simply the language of home. Everything changed after she moved north for college. Classmates politely asked her to repeat herself. Professors corrected her pronunciation. Interviewers suggested she adopt a more polished speaking style if she hoped to succeed in corporate America. Little by little, she taught herself to hide the accent. Eventually, she spoke it only during weekly phone calls with her grandmother. Even then, she caught herself switching back to standard English without realizing it. Tonight had been the first time in months that the old greeting had slipped out naturally. She wondered if anyone besides William had even recognized it. Around the ballroom, conversations slowly returned, but they no longer sounded relaxed. Investors whispered behind crystal glasses. Board members exchanged uncertain glances. Several guests quietly searched their phones, convinced they had just witnessed something important without understanding why. Ethan noticed all of it. He had spent his career reading rooms, negotiating billion-dollar acquisitions, and recognizing the exact second when confidence shifted into uncertainty. Whatever had happened between his father and this young waitress had completely changed the atmosphere of the evening. William finally inhaled deeply, his voice barely louder than a whisper. He spoke another short sentence in the same unfamiliar dialect. This time Aaliyah answered without thinking. The reply came naturally, shaped by memories of childhood kitchens, porch swings, and stories carried on ocean winds. A gentle smile appeared across William's face, the first genuine smile Ethan could remember seeing in years. It was not the smile of a businessman. It was the smile of someone who had unexpectedly found a missing piece of his own past standing quietly beneath the glow of a ballroom chandelier. The silence that settled between them was not uncomfortable. It felt ancient, as though two voices had found one another after traveling separate roads for half a century. William slowly lifted his chin and spoke another sentence, his pronunciation carrying the unmistakable rhythm of the low-country coast. Aaliyah answered instinctively, matching every inflection with quiet confidence she did not even realize she possessed. Around them, puzzled expressions spread across the ballroom. Guests leaned closer, hoping to recognize the language, but it slipped past them like the tide itself. Ethan glanced toward one of his senior executives, then toward the event coordinator. Neither had any explanation. Finally, he stepped beside his father again. "Can someone tell me what they are saying?" he asked softly. No one could. Aaliyah immediately became self-conscious. "I am sorry, sir," she said, returning to standard English. "I did not mean to interrupt the evening." William gently shook his head before she could take another step backward. "Please," he said with unexpected warmth. "Do not apologize for remembering where you came from." His voice was stronger than it had been all evening. Several people exchanged surprised looks. Ethan noticed it immediately. During countless family dinners over the past few years, his father often answered questions with only a few quiet words. Yet now he sounded clearer, steadier, almost younger. Something about hearing that familiar dialect had awakened a part of him no physician had ever reached. William smiled at Aaliyah with genuine curiosity. "Who taught you?" he asked. "My grandmother," she replied. "Her name is Evelyn Brooks. She always said that every family should protect its stories before they disappear." William slowly closed his eyes. The name itself did not seem familiar, but the sentiment did. He nodded almost imperceptibly, as though another distant memory had stirred just beyond reach. Ethan watched every subtle expression. His father had spent decades building factories, creating jobs, and leading one of the country's most respected companies. Yet he rarely spoke about the years before success. Childhood photographs were scarce. Stories about his early life were even rarer. Whenever Ethan had asked, William simply smiled and changed the subject. Those forgotten years had become a sealed chapter inside the Harrison family history. Tonight, that chapter appeared to be opening by itself. Across the ballroom, whispers grew louder. Some guests assumed Aaliyah must have known the Harrison family for years. Others guessed she had once worked for them. A few wondered whether the exchange had been carefully planned as part of the charity gala. None of them guessed the truth. Aaliyah herself remained completely bewildered. She had never met William Harrison before tonight. She had never visited one of the Harrison estates, attended one of their events, or imagined that the old dialect spoken in her grandmother's tiny kitchen could exist anywhere inside a Manhattan ballroom. William slowly reached inside the pocket of his tailored jacket and removed a small leather card holder that looked decades old. He stared at it for several long seconds before looking back at Aaliyah. His fingers traced the worn edges as though searching for courage rather than an object. Ethan recognized it immediately. The weathered holder had traveled with his father everywhere for as long as he could remember, yet he had never once seen it opened in public. Whatever rested inside had remained untouched for years. Until now. William's thumb slowly slid beneath the weathered leather flap. The ballroom seemed to hold its breath with him. No speeches echoed from the stage. No silverware touched porcelain. Even the musicians quietly lowered their instruments, sensing that something far more important than the evening's program had taken command of the room. Inside the old card holder rested a single faded photograph no larger than a credit card. Time had softened its edges, until they curled slightly inward. But the image remained clear enough to recognize a young white man standing beside an elderly black woman on the porch of a modest wooden home somewhere along the South Carolina coast. William stared at the picture for several seconds before carefully turning it toward Aaliyah. Her heartbeat quickened. The woman in the photograph wore a familiar smile. It was not her grandmother. It was someone even older. Someone whose face had watched over every family gathering through a framed portrait hanging above her grandmother's fireplace. "That is my great-grandmother," Aaliyah whispered almost involuntarily. Her name was Ruth Brooks. William slowly nodded, his eyes shining with quiet gratitude rather than surprise. "I prayed I was not imagining it," he said softly. "The moment I heard your greeting, I heard her voice again." Ethan stepped closer, unable to hide his confusion. "Dad, who is she?" William kept his gaze on the photograph instead of answering immediately. Memories often arrived like sunlight through old stained glass, revealing themselves one color at a time. "When I was a little boy," he finally began, "my father accepted seasonal work near the coast. We had almost nothing. We lived in a rented cabin that barely kept the rain outside. Every Sunday afternoon, there was one woman who never allowed us to leave hungry." He looked toward Aaliyah with remarkable tenderness. Ruth Brooks. The name settled over the ballroom like a forgotten hymn. Aaliyah felt goosebumps rise along her arms. She remembered countless evenings listening to stories about Ruth, a woman who believed every stranger deserved a chair at the table before being asked a single question. Her grandmother often repeated one lesson above all others. Kindness was the only inheritance that grew larger each time it was shared. William smiled faintly as another memory surfaced. "She always greeted everyone the same way. The exact words you spoke tonight. Not because they were formal, because she wanted every person who crossed her porch to feel they had already arrived home." Ethan remained speechless. For decades he had admired his father's discipline, resilience, and generosity without ever understanding where those qualities had first taken root. Tonight the answer stood quietly in a black server's uniform, holding a silver tray she had almost forgotten was still in her hands. Around them, the guests no longer whispered about business mergers or investment portfolios. They watched a family history unfold that could never have been measured in quarterly earnings or market value. Aaliyah blinked back unexpected emotion. She had walked into work believing she would spend another evening unnoticed among polished marble floors and glittering chandeliers. Instead, every lesson her grandmother had lovingly protected inside a small coastal home had somehow traveled hundreds of miles and decades through time, finding the one person who had never forgotten a simple greeting spoken with genuine respect. No one asked the orchestra to stop, yet not a single instrument resumed playing. The grand ballroom, designed to celebrate success, had quietly become a place where memory carried more authority than wealth. William carefully slipped the photograph back into its worn leather holder, treating it with the same respect someone might reserve for a priceless family heirloom. He looked at Aaliyah with a gentle smile that seemed to erase decades from his face. "Your great-grandmother never cared who had money," he said. "She only cared whether someone needed a seat at her table." Aaliyah felt a lump rise in her throat. She had heard those stories throughout her childhood, but hearing them repeated by a man whose name appeared on skyscrapers and charitable foundations gave them an entirely different weight. Ethan stood quietly beside his father, studying every expression. He had spent years believing he understood the man who raised him. Yet this evening continued revealing chapters that had never been spoken inside their home. "Why did you never tell me about her?" Ethan finally asked. William smiled faintly. "Some debts are too personal to explain until life decides the right moment." He turned back toward Aaliyah. "Ruth never accepted payment. My father tried many times. She always refused. She would simply say that kindness was not a business transaction." Those words landed heavily in Ethan's mind. His entire professional life revolved around negotiations, contracts, and measurable value. Everything had a price, a budget, or a return on investment. Yet the most important influence in his father's life had apparently asked for nothing at all. Across the room, several members of the restaurant staff exchanged surprised glances. The general manager quietly approached, worried that one of his newest employees had unintentionally disrupted the gala. Before he could speak, William politely raised his hand. "Please," he said, "allow Miss Brooks to stay." The manager immediately nodded and stepped back without another word. Aaliyah had never experienced anything like it. Only an hour earlier she had been making certain every wine glass was perfectly aligned and every place setting reflected the chandelier above. Now the founder of one of the country's most respected companies was asking that she remain at his side. She felt both honored and overwhelmed. William looked around the ballroom before speaking again, his voice steady enough for those nearest to hear. "Many people spend their lives searching for the secret behind success." He paused briefly. "Mine began on the porch of a woman who believed that feeding strangers mattered more than impressing neighbors." The nearby guests fell silent again. Nobody reached for a phone. Nobody interrupted. Even those who had never met Ruth Brooks found themselves imagining the modest wooden porch William described. A place where generosity had been measured by open doors instead of impressive addresses. Ethan slowly exhaled. For the first time that evening, he realized this encounter was not simply about the past. It was quietly reshaping the present. The values that had built the Harrison family legacy had not originated in boardrooms or universities. They had been planted decades earlier by an ordinary woman whose descendants still carried her voice. As Aaliyah met William's grateful eyes once more, she sensed there was still something he had not revealed. The faded photograph explained how they were connected, but it did not explain why. He had carried it with him every single day for so many years. Whatever story remained hidden inside that weathered leather holder had yet to be told, and William's thoughtful expression made it clear that the most important memory was still waiting to be shared. William rested both hands on the top of his cane and looked toward the towering windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline. But his eyes seemed fixed on a shoreline hundreds of miles away. "There is one part of the story I never shared," he said quietly. "Not because I wanted to forget it, but because I never found the right words." The guests nearest to him instinctively leaned closer. Ethan remained silent, sensing that interrupting would only cause another precious memory to retreat into the past. William drew a slow breath before continuing. "My father lost his job during one difficult season. We had almost nothing left. Every day he searched for work, and every evening he came home disappointed. I was too young to understand why adults looked so worried, but Ruth Brooks understood without anyone explaining a single thing." A gentle smile returned to his face. "Every Sunday, she placed an extra chair beside her table before we even arrived. She never asked whether we needed help. She already knew." Aaliyah listened with tears gathering in her eyes, remembering how her own grandmother had always insisted on setting one additional place at holiday dinners, even when no guests were expected. She had once asked why. Her grandmother simply answered, "You never know who might need to feel welcome." At the time, Aaliyah thought it was only a family tradition. Now she realized the tradition had traveled through generations unchanged. William slowly opened the leather holder once more. Behind the faded photograph rested a folded piece of yellowed paper, carefully preserved despite the passing decades. He unfolded it with remarkable care. The handwriting was elegant but simple, faded enough that only a few lines remained clearly visible. William smiled as he read the first sentence aloud. "Never measure your future by what is in your pocket today. Measure it by what you are willing to place in someone else's hands." He lowered the note and looked directly at Aaliyah. "Your great-grandmother gave this to my father the day we left South Carolina. She said one day we would understand it." Ethan stared at the fragile paper with astonishment. "You have carried that all these years?" William nodded. Every important decision I ever made passed through these words first. Ethan felt something shift deep inside him. Countless leadership seminars had praised his father's integrity. Business magazines celebrated his fairness. Employees admired his humility despite extraordinary success. Yet none of them knew that the principles shaping the Harrison legacy had begun with a handwritten note from a woman whose name had never appeared in history books. Aaliyah hesitated before speaking. My grandmother used to repeat those exact words whenever I worried about money or the future, she said softly. She always told me they came from her mother. William smiled with unmistakable certainty. Then the lesson survived exactly as Ruth intended. Around them, executives who normally discuss stock prices and quarterly forecasts found themselves quietly reflecting on their own families. Some remembered grandparents whose advice they had nearly forgotten. Others wondered how many ordinary people had quietly shaped extraordinary lives without ever receiving public recognition. William carefully folded the note and returned it to the leather holder before placing it over his heart. I believed I was preserving Ruth's memory, he said with quiet gratitude. Tonight I discovered that her family has been preserving it all along, and somehow that makes the world feel much smaller and much kinder than it did when I walked into this room. The words lingered in the air long after William finished speaking, as though every person in the ballroom had suddenly remembered someone who had quietly changed the course of their own life. No applause followed. It would have felt too small for a moment like this. Ethan looked at the leather holder in his father's hands, then at Aaliyah, and a question that had never crossed his mind before finally demanded an answer. If great-grandma Ruth meant that much to our family, he asked gently, why did we lose contact with yours? William released a slow sigh. Life happened, he replied. Jobs changed. Families moved. Letters stopped arriving. One generation assumed another would reconnect someday, and someday quietly became 50 years. Aaliyah lowered her eyes. Her grandmother had often mentioned relatives and friends who had drifted away over time, not because of anger, but because ordinary life moved faster than good intentions. She had never imagined one of those forgotten names belonged to the Harrison family. William smiled thoughtfully. Your great-grandmother never asked us to repay her. In fact, she insisted we should not. She said the only proper repayment was to pass kindness forward whenever we had the chance. Ethan stood quietly, replaying countless memories from his childhood. Every December, his father personally visited employee families instead of simply sending gifts. Every scholarship program the Harrison Foundation funded focused on first-generation college students. Every community kitchen the company supported operated without publicity or cameras. Ethan had always believed those decisions reflected good leadership. Now he understood they reflected an old promise. You have been honoring her all these years, he said softly. William nodded. Not perfectly, but I tried. Aaliyah felt a warmth spread through her heart that had nothing to do with the elegant ballroom. Her grandmother had often wondered whether anyone still remembered Ruth Brooks outside their small coastal community. Tonight she finally had her answer. More than remembered. Her kindness had quietly shaped one of the country's most respected business families. William looked toward Ethan with unusual seriousness. There is something else you should know. Ethan listened carefully. The scholarship program you expanded after taking over the company? William asked. Ethan nodded. It exists because of Ruth. When I signed the original papers decades ago, I promised myself that every student who received an opportunity through our foundation would become another way of setting an extra chair at her table. Ethan felt his throat tighten. He had modernized the foundation, increased its funding, and celebrated its growth in annual reports. Yet he had never known the simple image inspiring it all. An extra chair at the table. Aaliyah smiled through moist eyes. My grandmother still sets one, she whispered. William's face brightened with quiet delight. Then nothing has truly been lost. The surrounding guests listened in respectful silence. Some discreetly wiped away tears. Others looked at family members seated beside them with renewed appreciation. Expensive suits, designer gowns, and glittering jewelry suddenly seemed secondary to the invisible inheritance passing between generations through stories, values, and simple acts of generosity. Ethan slowly walked toward Aaliyah and extended his hand, not as a chief executive greeting an employee, but as one family acknowledging another. Thank you, he said sincerely. Aaliyah looked surprised. For what? Ethan smiled, for reminding us where our future really began. As their hands met, William quietly closed the leather holder once again, but this time it no longer felt like a container for old memories. It had become proof that the smallest acts of compassion could travel across decades, shaping lives long after the people who inspired them were gone. The ballroom remained quiet long after Ethan released Aaliyah's hand. The silence no longer felt uncertain. It felt respectful, as though every person present understood they had witnessed something impossible to schedule on an event calendar or include in a corporate agenda. William slowly turned toward the stage where the evening's charity presentation had been waiting to begin. The master of ceremonies stood patiently nearby, unsure whether to continue or simply allow the moment to unfold. William smiled warmly and gave a small nod. "If you do not mind," he said, "I would like to say a few words before the program continues." The request was met with immediate agreement. A microphone was brought to him, but he held it loosely, speaking with the calm confidence of someone who no longer needed to impress anyone. "Tonight," he began, "many of you expected to hear about investments, innovation, and the future of our foundation. Those things matter. But none of them would exist without a lesson I learned as a little boy on the porch of a woman who never asked what my family could offer in return." Every eye remained fixed on him. William slowly looked toward Aaliyah. "Most people believe wealth begins with money. I know differently. Wealth begins the moment someone chooses generosity over convenience." His words echoed gently through the ballroom. Ethan felt a quiet sense of humility settle over him. For years he had delivered keynote speeches about leadership, responsibility, and vision. Yet his father's simple sentences carried a depth no presentation slide could ever achieve. William continued, "Our family has been blessed beyond anything my younger self could have imagined. We built companies. We created opportunities. We established scholarships. But tonight I realized something important. We have spent decades honoring Ruth Brooks without ever thanking the family that continued living by her example." He turned toward Aaliyah once more. "That changes tonight." The audience responded with warm applause, not loud or dramatic, but sincere enough to fill the room with genuine appreciation. Aaliyah stood speechless. She had arrived expecting an ordinary shift, hoping only to earn enough to help her grandmother with monthly expenses and continue saving for graduate school. Never once had she imagined becoming part of the evening's most meaningful conversation. Ethan stepped beside his father and addressed the guests. "There is one tradition my father inherited that I intend to continue," he said. "Our foundation was never built to celebrate successful people. It was built to create opportunities for people whose quiet acts of character deserve to be remembered." He looked at Aaliyah with grateful respect. Sometimes the greatest legacy arrives wearing an employee name tag instead of a business title. Gentle laughter mixed with heartfelt applause. The tension that had filled the ballroom earlier completely disappeared, replaced by a feeling of shared humanity that reached every table. Several guests approached restaurant employees to thank them personally for their work. Others embraced family members seated beside them. Conversations shifted away from stock markets and luxury vacations toward grandparents, childhood memories, and the people who had shaped their lives without asking for recognition. William watched it all with peaceful satisfaction. He realized Ruth Brooks had once again accomplished exactly what she always believed possible. She had brought strangers together around a shared table. The only difference was that the table now stretched across an elegant Manhattan ballroom instead of a weathered wooden porch overlooking the South Carolina coast, proving that true kindness never remained trapped in one place because every generation willing to carry it forward became part of the same family story. The gala eventually continued, but no one remembered the order of the speeches or the names printed inside the evening's program. Long after the awards had been presented and the final course had been served, guests spoke about something entirely different. They spoke about an elderly businessman who had never forgotten a simple act of kindness. They spoke about a young waitress who carried her family's history with quiet dignity instead of pride. And they spoke about a language that almost disappeared, yet somehow preserved a promise across generations. Before leaving, William asked Aaliyah one final question. "Would your grandmother allow an old friend to visit?" Aaliyah smiled through grateful eyes. "She would probably insist that you stay for dinner." William laughed softly, a warm, genuine laugh that Ethan had not heard in years. "Then I already know what she will serve first," he replied. Conversation. A few weeks later, on a peaceful Saturday afternoon, a black sedan slowly pulled onto a narrow road lined with ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss. The destination was not a mansion or a corporate headquarters. It was a modest family home overlooking quiet marshland where Evelyn Brooks still greeted every visitor from her front porch. When she saw William step out of the car, she looked at him for several long seconds before recognition slowly brightened her face. Neither of them hurried. They simply walked toward one another with the calm certainty of people whose memories had patiently waited for the right moment to return. Ethan followed a few steps behind, carrying nothing more valuable than the weathered leather holder his father had finally decided should no longer remain hidden inside a jacket pocket. That afternoon, stories flowed across the old wooden table just as easily as sweet tea filled the glasses. Names were remembered. Photographs were shared. Laughter returned to places where silence had lived for far too long. Before sunset, William carefully placed the faded note from Ruth Brooks into a simple wooden frame and handed it to Evelyn. "It belongs here," he said. Evelyn gently shook her head with a knowing smile. "No," she answered. "It belongs wherever someone still lives by those words." Ethan looked around the porch and understood something that years of success had never taught him. Great legacies were rarely built in the rooms that received the most attention. They were built in ordinary homes where people chose generosity even when they had very little to give. Months later, the Harrison Foundation quietly introduced a new community initiative supporting neighborhood family kitchens, local mentorship programs, and scholarships honoring everyday citizens whose compassion strengthened their communities. There were no giant banners carrying Ruth Brooks's name because that was never what she would have wanted. Her legacy lived instead in every opportunity created for someone who needed an extra chair at the table. As for Aaliyah, she eventually completed graduate school while continuing to visit her grandmother whenever she could. She never stopped speaking the old dialect at home, and she never again felt embarrassed by the sound of her own heritage. She understood that preserving her family's voice was not about holding on to the past. It was about carrying hope into the future. Sometimes history survives inside monuments. Sometimes it survives inside books. But every now and then, history survives inside a single greeting spoken with sincerity, waiting for the right ears to hear it again. Because money can build remarkable buildings, influence remarkable decisions, and create remarkable opportunities, but only kindness can travel through generations without losing its value, reminding every person willing to listen that true greatness is never measured by what we own, but by the welcome we leave waiting for someone else.